Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want to tell you a story that unsettled me more than I expected, because I always believed that if a person became wise enough, disciplined enough, successful enough, they would be safe from losing themselves. But then I came across the life of Solomon, the man God himself called the wisest who ever lived. And what I found didn't comfort me, it disturbed me deeply, because somehow the man who understood everything, the man who built one of the greatest kingdoms the ancient world had ever seen, the man whose wisdom drew kings and queens from across continents, ended his life kneeling before gods he knew were not real. And I couldn't stop asking myself, how does that happen? Not to an ordinary man, but to the wisest man in history. At first, I thought I already knew the answer. Maybe it was power. Maybe it was desire. Maybe it was wealth, but the deeper I went into his story, the more I realized it wasn't any of those things alone. It was something quieter, slower, almost invisible, something that doesn't destroy you overnight, but changes you piece by piece, until one day you look back and you don't recognize who you've become. And what made this even more unsettling for me was the thought that maybe this isn't just his story. Maybe it's ours too, because if someone with that level of wisdom could slowly drift away from everything that once grounded him, what makes us think we are any different? What makes us think we would even notice it happening? So tonight, I don't want to just tell you what happened to Solomon. I want us to walk through it together, slowly, carefully, not as a lesson from the past, but as a mirror. Something that reflects parts of ourselves we don't always pay attention to. The small compromises, the silent shifts, the decisions that feel harmless in the moment, but quietly shape the direction of our lives. Because the truth is, Solomon didn't fall all at once. He didn't wake up one day and decide to lose everything that mattered. His fall began long before anyone could see it, like a crack in the foundation of a building. So small at first, you would ignore it until one day the entire structure collapses. And as we go through this story, I want you to keep one question in mind, not about him, but about yourself. If the wisest man who ever lived could lose his way so slowly, so silently, would you even notice if it was happening to you? So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes. I used to believe something very simple, something that felt almost undeniable at the time, that if you become smart enough, disciplined enough, successful enough, then failure simply doesn't happen to you. That life, in some quiet and predictable way, rewards those who do things right. And I built a large part of my thinking around that idea. Maybe you have too, because it sounds reasonable, doesn't it? If you study harder, think deeper, make better decisions, avoid obvious mistakes, then over time, things should work out. Not perfectly, but at least in your favor, at least enough to keep you from completely losing your way. And I remember there was a certain comfort in that belief, a kind of invisible safety net. Like, no matter how uncertain life felt, as long as I kept improving, kept learning, kept sharpening my mind, I would be okay, maybe not rich overnight, maybe not powerful in the eyes of the world, but steady, grounded, in control. Because intelligence, I thought, was the ultimate protection, not just from failure, but from self-destruction. But the longer I sat with that idea, the more I started to notice something unsettling, not in theory, but in real life. Because if you look closely, truly closely, at the people around us, at history, at stories that have lasted for centuries, you begin to see a pattern that doesn't quite fit that belief. People who were incredibly intelligent, people who clearly understood the world better than most, still making decisions that slowly unraveled everything they had built. Not because they didn't know better, but almost as if knowing better wasn't enough. And that's when a question started forming in my mind, quietly at first, almost like something I didn't want to fully confront, because it challenges something very fundamental, something many of us rely on to feel secure. The idea that we can think our way out of danger, that awareness alone is protection, that understanding the rules of life somehow exempts us from breaking them. So I started asking myself something I had never really asked before, not in a serious way, not in a way that demanded an honest answer. What if that belief is incomplete? What if intelligence doesn't guarantee direction? What if discipline doesn't guarantee alignment? What if success itself, the very thing we chase so intensely, quietly changes us in ways we don't notice until it's too late? And then the question became sharper, more uncomfortable, almost impossible to ignore. If you do everything right, if you make the smart choices, if you avoid the obvious traps, can you still lose? Not lose money, not lose status, but lose something deeper. Your clarity, your direction, the version of yourself you once trusted. Because that's the kind of loss no one really prepares you for. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it doesn't announce itself with a clear moment of failure. It happens slowly, quietly, in the background of a life that still looks successful from the outside. And that, to me, is far more dangerous, because you don't even realize it's happening until one day something feels off and you can't quite explain why. And the more I thought about this, the more I realized that maybe the real question isn't whether failure happens, because it clearly does, even to the smartest people, but how it happens, how someone who understands so much and can still drift so far, how someone who once had clarity can end up confused, not overnight, but step by step, decision by decision, almost imperceptibly. And that's where everything started to shift for me, because I stopped looking at intelligence as a shield and started seeing it as something more complicated, something powerful, but not infallible, something that can guide you, but not necessarily anchor you. And that realization, subtle as it may seem, changed the way I began to look at success itself. Because now, instead of asking how to win, I found myself asking something much quieter, much more difficult. How do you not lose yourself while winning? How do you stay aligned when everything around you is expanding, when opportunities multiply, when your world becomes bigger than it has ever been? Because maybe that's where the real challenge begins, not at the bottom, but at the top. And if that's true, then maybe the most dangerous assumption we can make is believing that we are safe simply because we are capable, because the truth might be, capability gets you there, but it doesn't keep you there. And that thought, slow, heavy, lingering, is what led me to a story I thought I already understood, but didn't. A story that doesn't just challenge what success looks like, but what it actually costs, and whether we would even recognize the moment we begin to pay for it. And that's when I came across the story of Solomon, not for the first time, but for the first time in a way that actually made me stop. Because before that, Solomon was just a name I had heard many times, a symbol, almost a reference people use when they talk about wisdom, like an idea more than a real person. But this time, something felt different, because I wasn't just reading about what he achieved. I was trying to understand who he was, and more importantly, how his life ended. And the description is almost impossible to ignore, not coming from people, not from history books alone, but from the narrative itself, that there had never been anyone like him before, and there would never be anyone like him again. Think about that for a moment. Not just intelligent, not just insightful, but singular. A mind so sharp, so precise, so deeply attuned to truth and judgment, that even kings and queens traveled across vast distances just to hear him speak, to ask him questions, to test whether the stories they had heard could possibly be real. And what makes it even more striking is that this wasn't wisdom earned slowly through failure. Not at first. It was given, chosen, almost like a divine endorsement. He asked not for power, not for wealth, not for long life, but for understanding, the ability to discern between right and wrong. And because of that, he was granted something beyond human comparison, a mind that could see through complexity, a heart that could listen beneath the surface of things, a clarity that most people spend their entire lives chasing and never fully reach. So naturally, when I started reading deeper, I expected a certain kind of story, the kind we are used to hearing. A steady rise, a wise king ruling justly, a life that becomes more refined, more grounded, more aligned over time. Because that's how we think it should go, right? If someone starts with that level of awareness, that level of insight, then their ending should reflect it. It should confirm everything we believe about wisdom and success. But then, almost without warning, the story begins to shift. Not dramatically at first, not in a way that immediately sets off alarms, but slowly, quietly, like something changing just beneath the surface. And then you reach a point in the narrative where you have to stop, because what you're reading doesn't match the image you've built in your mind. Because somehow the same man, the same mind, the same person who once stood as the highest example of wisdom ends up doing something that feels completely incompatible with everything he once represented. He begins to turn away, not just slightly, but fundamentally, toward things he himself would have once recognized as false, empty, even dangerous. And this is where it hit me, not as a piece of information, but as a kind of quiet shock, the kind that doesn't explode, but lingers, because it forces you to reconsider something much deeper than just his story. How does someone like that end up there? How does the person who sees the clearest end up walking in the wrong direction? Not by accident, not by ignorance, but while still carrying all that knowledge within him. And the more I sat with that question, the more uncomfortable it became, because it's easy to explain failure when someone lacks awareness. When someone is driven purely by impulse, when someone never understood the consequences in the first place. But Solomon didn't fit any of those categories. He understood deeply, more than most people ever will, and yet he still drifted. And that's what makes this the first real crack in the belief I once held so confidently. Because if the wisest man to ever live could reach a point where he bowed before things he knew were not real, then what exactly does wisdom protect you from? What does it guarantee? And maybe more importantly, what does it fail to prevent? Because up until that moment, I thought wisdom was the ultimate safeguard, the thing that separates those who stay on track from those who lose their way. But now, standing at the beginning of his story, already knowing how it ends, I realized something that I couldn't ignore anymore. Wisdom might guide you. It might elevate you. It might even set you apart from everyone around you, but it doesn't make you untouchable. And that realization, quiet as it was, became the first moment where I truly started paying attention, not just to what Solomon did, but to how it happened. Because somewhere between being called the wisest man alive and ending up in a place that contradicts everything that title represents, there is a process, something subtle, something gradual, something that doesn't announce itself. And if I could understand that, maybe, just maybe, I could understand something about my own path too. And that's when the questions stopped being interesting and started becoming unsettling. Because at first, it's easy to look at a story like this and reach for the most obvious explanations, the ones we've heard so many times they almost feel automatic. Maybe it was desire, maybe it was power, maybe it was the temptation of wealth. Those explanations are comfortable, familiar. They allow us to distance ourselves from the outcome, to believe that if we simply avoid those extremes, we'll be fine. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized that none of those answers really fit. Not completely, not in a way that explains the depth of what happened. Because people driven purely by desire don't usually build something as disciplined as Solomon did. People blinded by greed don't usually demonstrate that level of clarity. And people who are careless with power don't typically construct systems that function with such precision for so long. So the question kept returning, quieter each time, but heavier. How does this actually happen? Not on the surface, but underneath, not the visible fall, but the invisible shift that made the fall possible in the first place. Because whatever it wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic. It didn't look like destruction when it began. It must have looked reasonable, maybe even necessary, maybe even wise. And that's the part that started to stay with me, because if the beginning of his decline didn't feel wrong, if it didn't immediately contradict his identity, then that means it probably felt justified. It probably felt like something that made sense in the moment. Something small enough to ignore. Something subtle enough to blend into the rest of his life without raising alarm. And once you start thinking about it that way, the entire story changes. Because now you're no longer asking how someone falls, you're asking how someone slowly redefines what right means to themselves. How the line doesn't disappear, but quietly moves. How what once felt unacceptable becomes negotiable, and what was once negotiable becomes normal. And that shift, that almost imperceptible movement of internal standards, is far more dangerous than any external temptation because it doesn't confront you, it adapts to you. It adapts to you. It reshelves around your circumstances, your responsibilities, your relationships, until eventually it feels like you're still the same person, even though something fundamental has changed. And the more I thought about this, the more I realized that maybe the real cause isn't desire or money or power. Those are just amplifiers. They don't create the problem, they expose it. They magnify whatever is already happening beneath the surface. And if that's true, then the real question becomes even more difficult. What was already happening inside him? What quiet shift began long before anyone could see the results? Because it's one thing to lose control in a moment of weakness, it's another thing entirely to gradually reshape your identity while still believing you're in control. And that's what makes this so difficult to process, because it suggests that awareness alone isn't enough, that understanding something intellectually doesn't prevent you from drifting emotionally, that you can know the truth and still slowly move away from it. And I think that's the point where the story stops being about him and starts becoming uncomfortably personal. Because if the cause isn't something obvious, something external, something easy to avoid, then it might be something internal, something subtle, something we all experience in small ways. The quiet compromises, the moments where we tell ourselves it's not a big deal. The times we adjust our standards just slightly to fit our situation. And none of those moments feel like the beginning of a fall. They feel like adaptations, like maturity, like necessary decisions in a complex world. But what if that's exactly how it starts, not with a dramatic choice, but with a series of small adjustments that slowly change the direction of your life without you ever fully noticing it? And that thought, more than anything else, is what made this question linger in my mind. Not just how did it happen, but could it happen to me? Not in the same way, not on the same scale, but through the same mechanism, the same slow drift, the same quiet redefinition of what I'm willing to accept. Because if that's the case, then the real danger isn't making a mistake. It's becoming the kind of person who no longer recognizes it as a mistake. And once that line is crossed, even slightly, it doesn't take a dramatic event to continue moving in the wrong direction. It just takes time. And time, as I'm starting to understand, can change more than we think without ever asking for permission. And this is where the story became something else entirely for me. Not just a historical account, not just a lesson about a king who lived thousands of years ago, but something far more unsettling, because the deeper I looked, the clearer it became that Solomon didn't collapse in a single moment. There was no dramatic turning point, no sudden decision where everything changed overnight. Instead, it was something much harder to detect. Something that unfolded slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. And I think that's the part most people miss, because we're used to thinking about failure as an event, something you can point to, something that happens at a specific time, like a mistake, a scandal, a loss, but that's not what happened here. There was no single day where Solomon woke up and chose to lose himself. No clear line where everything before it was right, and everything after it was wrong. It didn't work like that. It was gradual. So gradual that it probably didn't feel like decline at all. It probably felt like progress, like adaptation, like the natural complexity of life expanding as his responsibilities grew. Because think about it, his world wasn't getting smaller. It was getting bigger, more alliances, more influence, more decisions, more people depending on him. And with that expansion came new pressures, new expectations, new compromises that didn't exist before. And that's where something subtle begins to happen. Something that doesn't look dangerous on the surface. You start making small adjustments, not because you want to betray your principles, but because the situation feels different, more complicated, less black and white. And each adjustment on its own feels harmless, even justified, because you can always explain it. You can always rationalize it. You can always say, this is necessary, this is temporary, this doesn't change who I am. But over time, those small adjustments don't stay small. They accumulate, they shift your perspective, they slowly redefine what feels normal. And because the change is so gradual, you don't experience it as loss. You experience it as continuity. You still feel like yourself. You still recognize your own voice, your own thoughts, your own intentions. And that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. Because if the change were sudden, you would resist it. If it were obvious, you would question it. But when it happens slowly, when it blends into the rhythm of your daily life, when each step feels reasonable on its own, you don't notice the direction you're moving in. You only see where you are, not how far you've drifted from where you started. And that's the terrifying part. Not that Solomon made a mistake, but that he likely didn't see it as a mistake while it was happening, because nothing in his environment would have forced him to confront it immediately. His kingdom was still thriving, his influence was still expanding, his reputation was still intact. From the outside, everything probably looked as strong as ever, maybe even stronger. And that creates a kind of illusion, a dangerous one, where external success masks internal drift, where the results of your actions don't immediately reflect the direction of your character. And because there's no immediate consequence, no visible breakdown, you assume everything is still aligned, that you're still on the same path, that nothing essential has changed. But something has changed, quietly, beneath the surface, not in what you achieve, but in what you allow, not in what you build, but in what you tolerate. And that distinction, subtle as it may seem, is where the entire story turns. Because once you start tolerating things you once resisted, once you begin to accept what you would have previously questioned, the foundation shifts, not enough to collapse immediately, but enough to weaken over time. And that weakness doesn't show itself right away. It waits, it spreads, it deepens, until eventually the structure can no longer hold. And by the time it becomes visible, by the time the consequences finally catch up, it feels sudden, it feels unexpected, but in reality it was forming long before that moment, long before anyone could see it, long before even he could recognize it. And I think that's what stayed with me the most. Not the scale of his rise, not even the extent of his fall, but the way it happened so slowly, so quietly, so consistently, that it never demanded his full attention until it was too late. Because if something like that can happen to someone with that level of awareness, that level of clarity, then it raises a question that is difficult to ignore. Not just about him, but about all of us. How many of the things we consider stable right now are actually shifting in ways we haven't noticed yet? How many small decisions, small compromises, small adjustments are quietly shaping a future we haven't fully seen? And that is where this story truly begins, not with the fall itself, but with the realization that the fall was never sudden. It was built piece by piece over time in ways that felt almost invisible. And once you see that, Once you understand that mechanism, you can't unsee it, not in this story, and not in your own life. And to understand how someone like Solomon could become who he eventually became, I realized I had to go back, not to the moment where everything went wrong, but to the moment where everything began. Because the origin of power often reveals more than its outcome. And in this case, it doesn't begin with peace or wisdom or divine blessing. It begins in a room filled with tension, uncertainty, and a king who is slowly losing his grip on life. King David is dying, not in battle, not in glory, but quietly, weak, unable even to keep himself warm. The same man who once stood against giants, who unified tribes, who survived years of exile and war, now lies fragile, diminished. And in that moment, something subtle but dangerous emerges, a vacuum, not just of strength, but of authority, because when power begins to fade, even slightly, the world around it starts to shift. And it doesn't take long for that shift to become visible, because another figure steps forward, not with hesitation, not with permission, but with certainty. Adonijah, one of David's sons, decides that the throne is his, not through inheritance confirmed, not through divine selection, but through declaration. He proclaims himself king, organizes support, gathers influential figures around him, and begins acting as if the transition has already happened. And what struck me here wasn't just the ambition, but the timing. Because Adonijah didn't wait for clarity. He didn't wait for David's final word. He moved precisely when the king was weakest, when decisions were hardest to enforce, when the structure that held everything together was beginning to loosen. And that tells you something important about power. It is never truly empty. The moment it starts to fade, someone else is already moving to fill it. And for a moment, it almost works. The plan is strategic, calculated. He gathers the right allies, hosts a royal gathering, builds momentum, creates the appearance of legitimacy. And if things had continued just a little longer without interruption, history might have taken a completely different path, because sometimes perception becomes reality faster than truth can catch up. But then, something unexpected happens. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through awareness, through people who understand what is at stake and act quickly, quietly, decisively, and suddenly the narrative shifts. Not because Adonijah failed to act, but because others acted faster. More precisely, in the one moment that still mattered. And this is where Solomon enters the story, not as a warrior, not as a conqueror, but as the chosen successor, the one who had been promised the throne, even if that promise had not yet fully materialized in the eyes of everyone watching. And in a matter of moments, the fragile balance of power is broken, decisions are made, orders are given, and Solomon is placed on the royal mule, a symbol so clear, so unmistakable that no one in that kingdom could misunderstand what it meant. And I can't help but imagine that scene, the contrast between two realities unfolding at the same time. On one side, a self-declared king celebrating his rise, confident, surrounded by supporters, believing the outcome is already secured. And on the other side, a quiet but decisive movement. A coronation happening almost in silence at first, then erupting into recognition, into sound, into something undeniable. Because once the signal is given, once the announcement spreads, everything changes instantly. What looked like certainty just moments before begins to dissolve. The supporters of Adonijah scatter, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Because power is rarely about belief, it's about alignment. And the moment alignment shifts, everything else follows. And that moment, that sudden reversal, tells you something else about the nature of power. It can look stable, it can feel inevitable, but underneath, it is often far more fragile than it appears, dependent on perception, timing, and the willingness of people to stand behind it. And when any of those elements change, even slightly, the entire structure can collapse in an instant. But what stayed with me the most wasn't just how Solomon became king, it was what that moment reveals about the foundation of his rise. because it wasn't purely peaceful. It wasn't simply the story of a wise man stepping into a role he was destined for. It was a transition shaped by tension, by urgency, by calculated moves made at exactly the right time. And that realization began to shift how I saw him, not just as the wisest man who ever lived, but as someone who entered power through a moment that required precision, awareness, and a certain kind of decisiveness. The kind that doesn't always look gentle, the kind that understands that timing matters just as much as truth. And maybe that's where the first layer of this story begins to take shape. Because before the wisdom, before the wealth, before everything that would later define him, there was this moment, this fragile transition, where power changed hands not through clarity, but through tension, not through peace, but through timing. And understanding that moment, I think, is the first step in understanding everything that comes after. And just when I thought I understood the kind of king Solomon would become, calm, wise, almost untouchable in his judgment, the story takes a turn that I didn't expect, not dramatic in appearance, but deeply revealing in meaning. Because what follows his rise to the throne isn't a period of quiet reflection or gentle consolidation. It is something much sharper, much more calculated, almost surgical in its precision. At first, there is mercy, or at least what looks like mercy. When Adonijah, the same man who had just tried to take the throne, is brought before Solomon, Solomon doesn't execute him immediately. Instead, he gives him a condition, a second chance, a moment where things could still resolve peacefully. And for a brief second, I remember thinking, maybe this is the version of Solomon I expected. Measured, restrained, in control of both power and emotion. But that moment doesn't last, because Adonijah returns, not with open rebellion, not with an army, but with something far more subtle. A request, a seemingly harmless appeal, asking through intermediaries to take Abishag, a woman connected to the former king. And at first glance, it feels almost insignificant, almost trivial compared to everything that has already happened. But Solomon doesn't see it that way, not even close, because he understands something beneath the surface, something political, something symbolic, something that transforms that simple request into a threat, not immediate, not obvious, but real enough. And in that moment, there is no hesitation, no debate, no visible struggle between mercy and judgment. The decision is made quickly, decisively, and Adonijah is executed. And I remember pausing there, not because the action itself was unexpected, but because of how it was done. There was no anger described, no emotional reaction, no sensational betrayal, just a conclusion reached and then carried out, as if the entire situation had been reduced to a calculation, a variable that needed to be removed for stability to exist. And it doesn't stop there, because what follows is not an isolated act. It's a pattern, one that becomes clearer with each decision. Joab, a powerful general, someone who had supported Adonijah, someone whose influence could shift the balance of power if left unchecked, seeks refuge at the altar, a place that traditionally offers protection, a last line of defense against execution, right? And yet, even that is not enough. Solomon orders his death anyway. And at that point, something began to shift inside me. Not in how I understood the events, but in how I understood him. Because this wasn't chaos, this wasn't impulsive violence, this was controlled, intentional, precise, each action removing a potential threat, each decision reinforcing the of his rule, but doing so without hesitation, without visible doubt. And then there were others, figures who represented instability, risk, opposition. Each one dealt with in a way that ensured they would not become a problem later. Not because they had already caused harm, but because they might. And that distinction, that shift from reacting to threats to eliminating possibilities, is where something deeper begins to emerge. Because this isn't just about power anymore. It's about control, about maintaining a system where uncertainty is minimized, where variables are reduced, where anything that could destabilize the structure is addressed before it has the chance to grow. And from one perspective, it works brilliantly. The kingdom becomes stable, secure, unified, no lingering rivals, no competing claims, everything aligned under one authority. But from another perspective, something else is happening. Something quieter, something harder to define, because each of these decisions, while justified, while strategic, while effective, also reveals a mindset, one that prioritizes order above all else, one that sees people not just as individuals, positions within a system, elements that either support stability or threaten it. And that's where I started to feel a kind of tension, not with the events themselves, but with what they suggested. Because this version of Solomon, the one making these decisions, the Untitled, doesn't look like the image I had in my mind. He isn't simply wise, he is calculating, deeply aware of consequences, but also willing to act in ways that feel distant, detached, almost clinical. And that raised a question I couldn't ignore anymore. Can wisdom and calculation become indistinguishable? Can the ability to see clearly also lead you to make decisions that slowly disconnect you from something essential? Because if every choice is reduced to its outcome, if every situation is evaluated purely through its impact on stability, then where does compassion fit? Where does restraint come from? And I'm not saying he was wrong. That's what makes this so complicated, because each decision can be explained, justified, even defended. But taken together, they begin to form a pattern. One that suggests that before Solomon became the symbol of wisdom, we often talk about he was already something else, something more complex, more dangerous, more human. And that's when the doubt really began for me, not about what he would become later, but about what was already there from the beginning. Because if this is how his reign starts, with precision, with calculation, with the quiet removal of anything that could threaten his control, then maybe the foundation of everything that follows isn't as stable as it seems. Maybe it's strong, incredibly strong, but also rigid, built in a way that leaves little room for deviation, little room for imperfection, little room for anything that doesn't fit neatly into the structure he is creating. And if that's true, then the question isn't just how he fell. It's whether something in the way he rose already contained the seeds of that fall, hidden, silent, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And just when the story begins to feel heavy, calculated, almost unsettling in the way power is being secured, something happens that changes the entire tone, not just of his reign, but of who he could become. Because after the throne is stabilized, after the threats are removed, after the structure of his authority is finally solid, Solomon goes somewhere unexpected, not to expand his kingdom, not to celebrate his power, but to offer something back, something that feels almost out of place when you consider everything that just happened. He goes to a place of sacrifice, a place where kings don't usually go when they've just secured absolute control. And there he offers not a symbolic gesture, not a small act to maintain appearances, but something overwhelming, something excessive in scale. 1,000 burnt offerings, not 10, not 100, 1,000. And I remember pausing there because it raises a question that's hard to ignore. What kind of mind does that? What kind of person moves from eliminating threats with such precision to expressing devotion with that level of intensity? And it's in that moment, in the stillness that follows, that something happens which doesn't fit into any normal pattern of power, something that transcends politics, transcends strategy, transcends everything we've seen so far, because that night, God appears to him. Not through intermediaries, not through signs or symbols, but directly. And what is offered next is something no human being had ever been offered before, and perhaps never will again. Ask anything. No conditions, no limitations, no negotiation. Just a question, simple in structure, but infinite in implication. And when I think about that moment, I can't help but stop and imagine it. Not as a distant event, but as something real, something immediate. Because if you were placed in that position, If everything was available to you in that instant, what would you choose? Wealth, security, power beyond challenge, the elimination of your enemies, a life without uncertainty? Most of us wouldn't even know where to begin. Not because the options are limited, but because they are endless. And in that kind of openness, our true priorities reveal themselves. Not what we say matters, but what we actually reach for when nothing is withheld. And this is where Solomon does something that completely reshapes how I saw him. Because after everything we've just witnessed, the precision, the calculation, the controlled removal of threats, you might expect him to ask for something that reinforces that direction. More power, more security, more control over everything around him. But he doesn't. He asks for something that feels almost unexpected, almost quiet in comparison, an understanding heart, a heart that listens, not a mind that calculates, not a system that controls, but a capacity to hear, to discern, to recognize the difference between right and wrong in situations where the answer isn't obvious. And that choice, simple as it sounds, carries a depth that's easy to miss because it reveals something about him that we haven't fully seen yet. Beneath the calculation, beneath the strategy, there is a desire for clarity, not just over others, but within himself. A recognition that ruling people isn't just about power, it's about judgment, about perception, about understanding what isn't immediately visible. And in that moment, something shifts, not just in how he is seen, but in what he becomes capable of, because the response to his request isn't limited, it isn't measured, it is multiplied. Wisdom beyond comparison, understanding beyond precedent, and alongside it, everything he didn't ask for: wealth, honor, influence that stretches beyond the boundaries of his kingdom. And for a moment, everything aligns perfectly. This is the version of Solomon that makes sense to us, the one we expect, the one we want to believe in, the man who chooses wisdom over power, who prioritizes understanding over control, who becomes not just a king, but something more, something almost impossible to replicate. And I remember feeling something close to relief when I reached this part, because it feels like the story is correcting itself, like everything that came before was just a necessary step toward this higher version of him, that the calculation, the precision, the difficult decisions were all leading here to a place where wisdom would guide everything that followed. But at the same time, there was something else, something quieter, something I couldn't quite ignore. Because if this is truly the best version of him, if this is the moment where everything is aligned, then what happens next becomes even more difficult to understand. Because now the question isn't just how someone falls, it's how someone rises this high, reaches this level of clarity, and still finds a way to drift away from it. And that contradiction, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once you see it, is what makes this moment feel less like a resolution and more like a beginning. Not the end of his story, but the point where everything that follows becomes far more complicated, far more human, and far more relevant than I ever expected it to be. And almost immediately after that moment, after the request, after the promise, after everything seems to align perfectly, something happens that reveals what that wisdom actually looks like in the real world. Not in theory, not in abstraction, but in a situation so messy, so human, so impossible to resolve, that no ordinary judgment could have handled it. Two women living in the same house, both claiming to be the mother of the same child, one baby alive, one baby dead, no witnesses, no evidence, no way to prove anything, just two voices, two stories, both insisting they are telling the truth. And I remember thinking, this is the kind of case that doesn't just test intelligence, it tests perception, intuition, something deeper than logic, because logic alone can't solve this. There's no data to analyze, and no clear pattern to follow. And if you try to approach it like a simple problem, you end up exactly where it started. Two claims, no resolution. And that's what makes what happens next so striking. because Solomon doesn't try to untangle the story. He doesn't ask more questions. He doesn't attempt to reconstruct the night or search for missing details. Instead, he does something completely unexpected. He calls for a sword, and for a moment, everything freezes, because this isn't what anyone expected. Not the court, not the guards, not even the women themselves. And then he gives the command, divide the living child in two, give half to one and half to the other. And I can imagine the silence in that room, the kind of silence that feels heavy, almost unbearable, because on the surface, it makes no sense. It feels cruel, irrational, completely disconnected from the idea of wisdom we were just introduced to. And that's what makes it so powerful, because it forces something to happen that no amount of questioning could achieve. The real mother reacts, not with calculation, not with argument, but with something immediate, instinctive. She cries out, not for her own victory, not for justice in the way we usually define it, but for the life of the child. She is willing to lose him completely if it means he survives. And the other woman responds differently, coldly, evenly, without that same urgency, without that same instinct. She accepts the division as if the outcome no longer matters as long as it is shared. And in that moment, everything becomes clear. The sword was never meant to harm the child, it was meant to reveal the truth. And that's when I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't just intelligence, this wasn't just cleverness. This was something else entirely. Something that operates beneath the surface of words, something that recognizes human nature. Not by what people say, but by how they respond under pressure. Because what Solomon did in that moment was create a situation where truth could no longer hide behind explanation, where the reality of who each person was had to reveal itself through action, not intention. And that requires a level of understanding that goes beyond knowledge. It requires insight into how people actually behave, not how they claim to behave. And that's the difference. Subtle, but profound, because intelligence can solve problems, but this kind of wisdom reveals people. And once I saw that, I understood why his reputation spread so quickly, why people feared his judgment, why they believed there was something almost supernatural about the way he saw the world, because it was just about being right. It was about seeing through the layers that most people never even notice. And this moment, simple in structure, but immense in implication, marks the beginning of something much larger. Because now the story isn't just about a king who is given wisdom, it's about a king who can apply it in a way that transforms impossible situations into clarity, who can turn confusion into revelation, who can expose truth without force. And this is where the peak begins. Not in wealth, not in power, but in the demonstration of something that feels almost untouchable. A mind that doesn't just process information, but understands the human condition itself. And for a moment, everything makes sense. Everything aligns with the image we want to believe in. The wise king, the just ruler, the man who sees what others cannot. And maybe that's why what comes later feels so difficult to accept. Because once you witness this level of clarity, this level of understanding, it becomes almost impossible to imagine how someone like this could ever lose it. How someone who can see so deeply into human nature could ever fail to see what is happening within himself. And yet, that question remains, quietly waiting as the story continues forward, because the higher the clarity, the harder it is to explain the blindness that follows, and that contrast between what he could see in others and what he would later fail to see in himself is what makes this story impossible to ignore and impossible to forget. And this is the point where the story expands, not just in scale, but in complexity. Because up until now, I had been looking at Solomon as a person, his decisions, his character, his mind. But what comes next forces you to look at something much bigger, not just the man, but the system he built around himself. And the more I tried to understand it, the more I realized that this wasn't just a kingdom. It was something far more refined, far more structured, almost engineered. Because what Solomon creates isn't random prosperity, it isn't luck, it isn't just the natural outcome of being in power. It is organized, deliberate, precise, and at the center of it, there is a system that quietly holds everything together. A structure so efficient, so consistent, that it almost disappears into the background. And yet, without it, nothing else would work. He divides the entire kingdom into 12 administrative regions, not tribes in the traditional sense, not loose territories, but organized districts, each one assigned a specific responsibility, each one governed in a way that feeds directly into the center. And what struck me wasn't just the division itself, but the logic behind it. Each region is responsible for sustaining the royal court, not all at once, not in a way that overwhelms them, but in rotation, 1 month at a time, 12 regions, 12 months, a cycle that never stops, never collapses, never leaves the system without supply. And I remember thinking, this isn't just governance, this is design, because what he's created here is predictability, stability, a rhythm that allows the entire kingdom to function without chaos, without sudden strain, without the kind of imbalance that usually leads to breakdown. And in a world where most systems relied on force, on unpredictable taxation, on whatever could be taken in the moment, this approach feels almost ahead of its time. And then there's the logistics, something that most people overlook. But once you start paying attention to it, it becomes impossible to ignore, because feeding a royal court isn't simple. It's not just about having resources, it's about moving them, storing them, distributing them, making sure that nothing runs out, not for a day, not for a week, not ever. Thousands of people, not just soldiers, but servants, officials, craftsmen, visitors, all depending on a system that has to function continuously without interruption. And that requires something beyond intelligence. It requires coordination, foresight, an understanding of how individual parts connect to a larger whole. And what's fascinating is that this entire structure operates almost invisibly. There's no dramatic moment where it announces itself, no single event that highlights its brilliance. It simply works, day after day, month after month, quietly sustaining everything that depends on it. And that's when I started to see Solomon differently again, not just as a wise judge, not just as a king who could resolve impossible disputes, but as something else entirely, a systems thinker, someone who doesn't just respond to problems, but designs environments where problems are less likely to occur in the first place, because that's what this is really about: reducing uncertainty, controlling variables, creating a framework where complexity can exist without collapsing into chaos. And when you look at it that way, it becomes clear that his strength wasn't just in understanding people, it was in understanding structures, how to build them, how to maintain them, how to make them resilient. And from the outside, it looks perfect. Everything aligned, everything functioning, nothing missing, no shortages, no visible breakdowns. And that kind of consistency, that kind of reliability creates something powerful. Not just wealth, not just stability, but confidence. The belief that the system is unshakable, that it will continue to work because it has always worked. But at the same time, there was something else, something quieter, something that didn't fit as neatly into that sense of perfection, because systems like this, as efficient as they are, require something in return. They don't sustain themselves. They draw from the people who exist within them. They depend on participation, on contribution, on effort that is often unseen. And once you start thinking about that, the picture becomes slightly more complicated, because behind every system that runs perfectly, there are individuals making it run. People whose lives are shaped by its demands, whose time, whose labor, whose energy becomes part of the structure itself. And while the system appears balanced from above, you begin to wonder what it feels like from within. And I don't think I fully understood that tension at first, because it's easy to admire something that works, something that appears flawless in its execution. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized that perfection at the system level doesn't always translate to simplicity at the human level. Sometimes it creates the opposite, something heavier, something more complex, and that realization didn't take away from what Solomon had built. If anything, it made it more impressive, but it also made it more real, more human, less like an ideal, and more like something that carries both strength and cost at the same time. And maybe that's what makes this stage of his so important, because this is the peak of control, the peak of organization, the moment where everything works exactly as it should. And from here, everything that follows, every shift, every change, every crack that begins to form will happen within a system that looks perfect on the outside. And that contrast between what appears stable and what may be slowly shifting beneath it is something I couldn't ignore anymore. Because if a system this strong can still hold hidden tension, then what does that say about everything else we build in our own lives? And just when I thought the system itself was the peak of what Solomon had built, the story moves into something even harder to grasp, something that shifts from structure to scale, from organization to magnitude. Because now we're not just looking at how the kingdom works, we're looking at what it produces. And the numbers begin to feel almost unreal, almost disconnected from anything we would normally expect from the ancient world. Gold. Not in small amounts, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a constant flow, a measured influx. Something that arrives year after year with a consistency that feels almost impossible, 22 tons every single year. And I remember pausing there, trying to make sense of it. Because it's one thing to hear that a king was rich, and it's another thing entirely to realize that his wealth operated on a scale that distorted the meaning of value itself. 22 tons of gold, not accumulated over decades, not the result of a lifetime, but a recurring cycle, a system that feeds itself, that continues to generate more than most kingdoms could ever imagine possessing. And when you try to picture that, not as a statistic, but as something real, something physical, something that exists in space, it starts to feel overwhelming. Because gold in that world wasn't just wealth, it was stability, power, influence. It was the thing that defined what mattered, what endured, what could not be easily replaced. And yet, in Solomon's kingdom, it becomes almost routine, almost expected, part of the background rather than the highlight. And then there's silver, something that, in most societies, forms the foundation of everyday exchange, something that people rely on, something that carries meaning in daily life. And yet, here it loses its significance, not because it changes, but because everything around it expands so dramatically that it no longer holds the same weight. Silver becomes common, ordinary, almost irrelevant. And that's when something shifted for me, not in how impressive this all is, but in how it feels. Because at a certain point, abundance stops being just abundance. It becomes distortion. It changes the way things are perceived, the way they are valued, the way they are understood. Because when something becomes too available, too consistent, too overwhelming in its presence, it loses the very quality that made it valuable in the first place. And that doesn't just apply to gold or silver. It applies to everything. Influence, power, even success itself. And I couldn't help but notice the subtle tension in that, because from the outside, this is the ultimate achievement. A kingdom overflowing with wealth, resources beyond comparison, a system that not only sustains itself, but expands continuously. And yet, beneath that surface, there is something slightly off, something that doesn't feel as stable as it appears, Sam. Because when value begins to blur, when distinctions start to disappear, when what was once rare becomes ordinary, you begin to lose something important, not materially, but perceptually. The ability to recognize what truly matters, the ability to differentiate between enough and excess, between growth, balance, and imbalance. And that's when the thought began to settle in more clearly, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet suspicion that maybe this level of wealth isn't just a sign of success, maybe it's also a sign of something else, something harder to define, something that doesn't immediately reveal itself as a problem, but slowly changes the environment in which decisions are made. Because when everything is available, when nothing feels scarce, when limits disappear, the way you think begins to change. Your sense of proportion shifts. Your understanding of consequences becomes less immediate, less tangible. And that creates a kind of distance, not just from reality, but from the boundaries that once kept things grounded. And I think that's where I started to feel it most, not in the numbers themselves, but in what those numbers imply. Because a system that generates that level of wealth, it isn't just efficient, it's dominant. It reshapes the environment around it. It pulls everything into its orbit. And in doing so, it changes the conditions under which choices are made. And when the conditions change, even slightly, the decisions that follow can begin to shift as well. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, subtly, in ways that feel justified in the moment, but accumulate over time. And that's the part that stayed with me, because this doesn't feel like a problem yet, not clearly. Not in a way that demands correction. It still looks like success, still feels like progress, still operates with precision. But somewhere within that expansion, within that overwhelming abundance, there is a change happening, a change in how things are valued, a change in how decisions are weighed, a change that doesn't announce itself, but quietly adjusts the foundation on which everything else rests. And maybe that's why it's so difficult to see, because nothing is breaking, nothing is failing, everything is still working. And when everything works, we tend to assume everything is right. What everything is right, we stop questioning, we stop examining, we trust the system because it continues to produce results. But what if the results themselves are part of the shift? What if the very thing that confirms success is also the thing that slowly alters its direction? And that's when I realized this isn't just about wealth anymore. It's about what wealth does, not externally, not in the structure of the kingdom, but in the perception of the one who leads it. And once that thought settles in, even quietly, it changes the way you see everything that follows, because now the question isn't just how much he had, but what having that much begins to do to a person over time without them ever fully noticing it. And just when I thought I had reached the limits of what Solomon had built, when the system felt complete, when the wealth already seemed beyond comprehension, the story widens again. And this time, it's no longer contained within the borders of his kingdom. It stretches outward, across distance, across continents, into something that feels less like a nation and more like a central point in the movement of the world itself. Because what Solomon understood, perhaps better than any king before him, is that power isn't just about what you control directly. It's about what flows through you, what passes your territory, what depends on your position without even realizing it. And when you look at the geography of his kingdom, something becomes clear, something that almost feels like an advantage designed in advance. His land sits between regions that define the ancient world, Africa to the south, Asia to the east, and the pathways leading toward Europe to the north. And that placement, that narrow corridor between major civilizations, becomes something more than just land. It becomes a funnel, a passage that everything must move through. And I remember thinking, this isn't accidental, or at least he didn't treat it as accidental. Because instead of simply ruling what he had, he turned his position into leverage. Every caravan, every shipment of goods, every merchant carrying spices, metals, textiles, everything moving between these regions passes through territory he controls. And that means something very simple, but incredibly powerful. Nothing moves without him benefiting from it. And when you start to see it that way, the scale of his influence begins to shift, because now it's not just about internal production, not just about what his land can generate. It's about everything that flows beyond it, everything that connects distant places, everything that depends on the routes he oversees, in the Karashim, and then there's the sea. Because controlling land routes is one thing, but expanding into maritime trade, into territories that extend beyond the visible horizon, that's something else entirely. And Solomon doesn't do it alone, which is what makes it even more interesting. He forms an alliance, not with a weak partner, not with a subordinate state, but with a power that specializes in something he does not. The Kingdom of Tyre, known for its ships, its sailors, its mastery of the sea. And I found that detail particularly revealing because it shows a different kind of intelligence. Not just the ability to build, but the awareness of limitation, the recognition that control doesn't come from doing everything yourself, but from knowing who to connect with. And through that alliance, something new emerges, a fleet not confined to coastal travel, not limited to nearby exchanges, but capable of long journeys, voyages that take years, reaching places far beyond the immediate world Solomon inhabits. And what returns from those journeys isn't just wealth, it's diversity, it's rarity. It's the kind of accumulation that transforms a kingdom into something almost mythical. Gold, silver, ivory, animals that most people in his land had never seen, objects that carry not just value, but curiosity, status, proof that his reach extends far beyond what can be mapped easily. And I couldn't help but pause there, because this isn't just expansion, it's integration. It's the weaving together of multiple systems, land routes, sea routes, alliances, economies, all converging into one central structure, one point of coordination, one place where everything connects. And that's when the idea of control begins to take on a different meaning. Not control in the sense of force or domination, but control through positioning, through influence, through becoming essential to the flow of the world around you. Because when enough systems depend on your stability, your presence becomes necessary, not just to your own people, but to everyone connected to those networks. And that kind of influence, subtle as it is, can be more powerful than any army. But at the same time, there was something else, something I couldn't quite ignore. Because when your reach extends that far, and when your influence connects that many moving parts, the complexity doesn't just increase externally, it increases internally as well. More connections, more dependencies, more variables to maintain, and each one introduces a layer of pressure, a need to sustain what has already been built, to ensure that nothing collapses, nothing disrupts the flow. And that's where the balance begins to feel fragile. Not visibly, not immediately, but structurally, because the more interconnected a system becomes, the more sensitive it is to change, the more difficult it is to adjust without affecting everything else. And I started to wonder, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet observation, whether this level of control, this level of integration, comes with something that isn't obvious at first, something that doesn't appear as a problem while everything is working, but becomes significant over time. Because when you are at the center of everything, when the movement of goods, wealth, influence all pass through you, there's a tendency to believe that the system will always hold, that it will continue because it always has, that your position within it is secure. But what if that sense of control is only partial? What if it depends on factors that aren't entirely within your grasp? What if the very networks that give you power also create conditions that slowly change the way you think, the way you decide, the way you respond to complexity? And that's the part I couldn't fully resolve, because from one perspective, this is mastery. This is the peak of what a kingdom can achieve. Influence that stretches across continents, systems that connect land and sea, alliances that amplify strength rather than divide it. But from another perspective, it feels like something that is growing beyond the individual who created it, something that requires constant maintenance, constant awareness, constant adjustment, and if even one part begins to shift, it could affect everything connected to it. And maybe that's the tension that defines this stage of the story, not between success and failure, but between control and complexity. between expansion and stability. Because the higher the system rises, the more delicate its balance becomes. And somewhere within that balance, something subtle continues to form, not visible yet, not disruptive yet, but present, waiting, as everything continues to expand just beyond what anyone can fully see. And just when it feels like the story has already reached a point where nothing more can be added, where the system is perfect, the wealth is overwhelming, the influence stretches across continents, something happens that almost feels like a final test, not of power, not of structure, but of truth itself. Because there comes a moment when everything that has been built, everything that has been said, everything that has been rumored, is no longer enough on its own. It has to be seen. And that's where Queen of Sheba enters the story. Not as a passive observer, not as someone drawn by curiosity alone, but as a ruler in her own right, someone who understands power, wealth, influence, someone who has built her own system, her own network, her own version of what success looks like. And that's what makes her arrival so significant, because she is not easily impressed. She doesn't come to admire, she comes to test. And I remember thinking that changes everything, because admiration can be superficial, it can be based on distance, on stories that grow larger as they travel, but testing requires something else. It requires doubt, it requires scrutiny, it requires a willingness to challenge what others accept without question. And so she travels, not a short journey, not something convenient, but a long, demanding passage across desert and distance, bringing with her not just gifts, but questions, difficult ones, layered ones, the kind that don't have simple answers, the kind that reveal whether someone truly understands what they claim to understand. And when she arrives, what she encounters isn't just a king. It isn't just a palace. It isn't just wealth displayed for effect. It's a system, a complete environment. Something that functions at every level, from the way people move, to the way decisions are made, to the way everything is arranged with intention. And I try to imagine what that must have felt like, to step into a place where every detail reflects control, where nothing feels random, where even the smallest elements seem to align with a larger design, because that's what the accounts suggest, not just that it was impressive, but that it was coherent, that everything worked together. And then comes the moment that defines her purpose there. The questions, not casual conversation, not polite exchange, but challenges, intellectual tests, problems that had no easy resolution, things that would expose inconsistency, hesitation, gaps in understanding. And this is where everything could have faltered, because it's one thing to build, it's another to sustain under pressure. And yet, there is no hesitation, no delay, no need for consultation. Every question is answered correctly, without uncertainty. And I remember feeling something shift again, not just admiration, but something closer to recognition, because this isn't performance, this isn't rehearsed, this is real, this is the kind of clarity that doesn't rely on preparation. It comes from within, from a depth that can't be easily imitated. And then she observes everything else, not just his mind, but the structure around it, the organization, the flow, the way the court operates, the way the servants are arranged, the consistency of the entire environment. And what she sees isn't a collection of impressive parts, it's a unified whole. And that's when her conclusion emerges, not as exaggeration, not as flattery, but as something almost reluctant, almost surprising even to her. What she had heard wasn't enough. The reality exceeds the stories. And that sentence stayed with me longer than I expected, because it almost never happens that way. Usually, distance amplifies, stories grow larger than truth. Expectations are inflated beyond reality, but here the opposite occurs. What exists in front of her surpasses what she was prepared to believe. And that's when I realized this is the peak, not just of wealth, not just of power, but of alignment, where everything matches, where reputation reflects reality, where the external and internal are in complete agreement, Because at this point, there is nothing left to prove, no hidden weakness exposed, no inconsistency revealed, no flaw that disrupts the image. Everything holds, everything works, everything exceeds expectation. And for a moment, it feels complete, like the story could end here, perfectly, with nothing unresolved, nothing left unexplained, because this is what success is supposed to look like. This is the version we imagine, the one where everything reaches its highest point and stays there. But at the same time, something quieter remains. Something that doesn't disappear, even in this moment of perfection. Because if this truly is the highest point, if nothing surpasses this, then what comes next can only move in one direction. And that's the part that lingers, not in what she saw, but in what follows after this moment. Because the higher the peak, the more difficult it becomes to understand the fall, and the more important it becomes to pay attention to what changes. Not outside, but within, even when everything still appears exactly as it should. And this is where the story changes in a way that is almost invisible at first, not dramatic, not explosive, not something that immediately feels like the beginning of a fall, but something quieter, something that blends so naturally into the structure of success that you might not even question it, because at the peak of everything he has built, at the height of his power, his influence, his stability, something begins to expand. And not outward into systems or trade or alliances, but inward into his personal life. 700 wives, 300 concubines, 1,000 women. And I remember when I first read that number, it didn't feel real. It felt symbolic, exaggerated, like something meant to represent abundance rather than describe it. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized that the number itself isn't the most important part. What matters is what that number represents, what it reveals about the kind of life he was living and the kind of choices he was making. Sodomate. Because it's easy, almost automatic, to reduce this to something simple, to say it was desire, indulgence, excess. But the deeper you look, the more you understand that it wasn't just that, not primarily, because in that world, marriage wasn't just personal, it was political, it was strategic, it was a way of forming alliances, of securing peace, of connecting kingdoms through bonds that were harder to break than treaties alone. Each marriage wasn't just a relationship, it was an agreement, a connection between nations, a way of stabilizing borders, reducing conflict, expanding influence without war. And when you look at it that way, the number begins to make a different kind of sense, not emotionally, but structurally. Because from a political perspective, it's brilliant. It transforms potential enemies into partners. It turns uncertainty into cooperation. And that's what makes this so complicated, because on the surface, it works, just like everything else in his kingdom. It strengthens the system. It expands the network. It reinforces his position as a central figure, not just within his own land, but across multiple regions. And from the outside, it probably looked like another example of his intelligence, another layer of strategic thinking applied to the problem of maintaining power. But at the same time, there's something else happening. There's something else happening, something that doesn't show up in the numbers, something that doesn't appear in the structure of alliances. Because each of those connections, each of those relationships brings something with it, not just loyalty, not just political stability, but culture, belief, perspective. And I started to realize that this isn't just about how many, it's about what comes with them. Because every person carries their own world, their own understanding of reality, their own traditions, their own way of seeing what matters. And when you bring that many different worlds into one place, into one life, into one environment, you're not just expanding your influence. You're also introducing complexity, diversity, and with that, tension. And at first, that tension doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like richness, like connection, like a broader understanding of the world, because exposure to different perspectives can deepen insight, it can challenge assumptions, it can expand awareness, And in many ways, that aligns with everything we've seen so far: the pursuit of understanding, yeah, the desire to see beyond the obvious. Um, but the more I thought about it, the more I began to wonder where the line is. Where does expansion become dilution? Where does connection begin to affect alignment? Because when you bring together that many influences, that many beliefs, that many ways of seeing the world, something has to shift, something has to adjust. And the question that started forming in my mind wasn't whether these alliances were effective, they clearly were, but what they required in return, not politically, but internally. What kind of compromises begin to emerge when maintaining peace becomes more important than maintaining clarity? What kind of adjustments feel necessary when the stability of your system depends on accommodating perspectives that don't fully align with your own? And that's when I started to feel it again, that subtle tension. Not something obvious, not something that demands immediate attention, but something that sits quietly beneath the surface. Because nothing is breaking yet, nothing is failing, everything still works. The system is still intact, the alliances are still holding, the kingdom is still strong, but something has changed. Not externally, not in a way that can be measured or seen easily, but internally in the environment of his life, in the number of influences surrounding him, in the constant presence of perspectives that require consideration, negotiation, adaptation. And maybe that's how it begins. Not with a clear mistake, not with a visible shift, but with an expansion that slowly introduces complexity beyond what can be fully managed, beyond what can be fully aligned. And in that space, something subtle starts to move. Not enough to be noticed, not enough to be questioned, but enough to begin shaping what comes next. Fra, and this is the moment where everything becomes almost invisible, not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening feels too small to matter, too reasonable to question, too easy to justify. Because after all the expansion, all the alliances, all the relationships that now surround his life, something begins to shift, not in a way that looks like betrayal, but in a way that looks like accommodation. It doesn't start with rejection. It doesn't start with turning away completely. It begins with permission, a small allowance, a quiet decision, a subtle opening, allowing space, allowing practices that were once outside the boundaries of what he believed, not as a replacement, not as a contradiction, but as a concession. Something done to maintain peace, to avoid conflict, to honor the people now connected to him through those alliances. And at first, it probably didn't feel like a problem. It probably felt like wisdom, like balance, like the kind of flexibility that strong leaders need in a complex world. Because when you're dealing with different cultures, different beliefs, different expectations, strict boundaries can feel rigid, even unnecessary. And small adjustments can feel like the mature thing to do. So a space is allowed a place where others can practice what they believe, not central, not dominant, just present, something contained, something that doesn't interfere with the larger structure, and then something even smaller, an altar, not grand, not significant in scale, just a structure, a physical acknowledgement of something that wasn't there before. Something that exists alongside everything else, not replacing it, just existing beside it. And this is where I had to stop, not because the action itself was dramatic, but because of how easily it could be overlooked. Because nothing here feels like a collapse. Nothing here feels like the kind of decision that leads to downfall. It feels like diplomacy, like coexistence, like something that makes sense given the complexity of his situation. But that's exactly what makes it dangerous, because the first step isn't supposed to feel wrong. If it did, it wouldn't happen. The first step always feels justified, necessary, even wise, because it's small, contained, limited in scope. It doesn't threaten the identity you've built. It doesn't force you to confront anything uncomfortable. It simply adjusts the environment slightly in a way that seems manageable. And that's when I realized something that stayed with me longer than anything else in this part of the story. It's not the big decisions that define the direction of a life. It's the small ones, the ones that don't seem important enough to question, the ones that don't create immediate consequences, the ones that quietly redefine what is acceptable without ever announcing it. Because once something is allowed, once it exists within your space, it changes the baseline. It becomes part of the environment, part of what is normal. And from that point forward, every decision is made in relation to that new normal. And the difference is so subtle, so gradual, that you don't feel it happening. You don't wake up and think something has changed. You simply continue adjusting, accommodating, moving forward as if everything is still aligned. But it isn't, not completely. Something has shifted, not in what you believe explicitly, but in what you are willing to tolerate. And that distinction, as small as it seems, is where everything begins to move in a different direction. Because tolerance has a way of expanding. Once a small allowance is made, it becomes easier to make it another, not because you want to, but because the resistance is lower. The boundary is already softened, the line is no longer as clear as it once was, and that's when the pattern begins. Not as a conscious choice, but as a sequence of decisions that feel consistent with the last, each one building on the previous, each one slightly easier than the one before. And what struck me the most is that none of this requires a dramatic moment. None of it requires a clear break from who you were. It happens within continuity, within the flow of a life that still looks successful, still functions, still produces results, which makes it almost impossible to detect. Because when nothing is breaking, you assume nothing is wrong. When everything still works, you assume everything is still right. And that's where the real danger lives, not in the visible collapse, but in the invisible shift. The moment where something small is allowed, something that doesn't seem to matter, something that feels like a necessary compromise, but isn't. And once I saw that, once I understood that the beginning of everything wasn't a dramatic fall, but a quiet permission, I couldn't unsee it. Not in this story, and not in anything else. Because it suggests something that's hard to ignore, that the direction of a life can change, not through one defining moment, but through a series of small allowances, each one insignificant on its own, but together powerful enough to alter everything that follows. And this is the part that stayed with me longer than anything else, not because it's dramatic, but because it's almost invisible. Because what happens next is not a rejection, not a sudden turning away, not a moment where everything is abandoned at once. It's something much more subtle, much more difficult to detect, something that doesn't feel like a break, but like a shift. Because Solomon doesn't wake up one day and decide to leave everything behind. He doesn't suddenly reject what he once believed. There is no clear moment where he crosses a line and knows it. Instead, his heart begins to move, slowly, almost imperceptibly, in a direction that feels small at first, so small that it doesn't trigger resistance, it doesn't demand attention, it doesn't feel like a decision that defines anything. And I think that's what makes this so unsettling, because we tend to think of change in terms of clarity, something we choose, something we recognize, we can point to and say, that's when it happened. But here, there is no such moment. There is only movement, gradual, consistent, almost silent. It's not that he stops believing, it's that his focus shifts slightly, then slightly again. And each shift is small enough to justify, small enough to ignore, small enough to feel like it doesn't matter in the larger picture. Because everything else is still intact. The system still works. The kingdom is still stable. The influence is still expanding. So there's no reason to question it. No reason to stop. No reason to think that anything essential is being lost. And that's when I realized something that I hadn't fully understood before, that the most dangerous kind of change isn't the one that confronts you. It's the one that adapts to you. The one that fits so naturally into your life that it doesn't feel like change at all. Because if something challenges you directly, you respond, you resist, you evaluate. But when something moves quietly, when it aligns itself with your circumstances, your responsibilities, your relationships, it becomes part of your reality without asking for permission. And that's exactly what's happening here. Not a break, but a bend, not a fall, but a tilt. And over time, that tilt becomes direction, because the more it happens, the more it feels normal, the more it feels like this is simply how things are now. And once something feels normal, it stops being questioned. It becomes part of the baseline, part of the environment in which every new decision is made. And that's where the real shift occurs, not in what you claim to believe, but in what actually guides your choices. Because those two things can begin to separate slowly, quietly, without creating immediate tension. You can still say the same things, still hold the same ideas in theory, still see yourself as the same person, while your actions begin to reflect something different, something that has been adjusting beneath the surface for a long time. And the longer that continues, the wider the gap becomes between who you think you are and who you are becoming. But here's the part that unsettled me the most. He doesn't notice, not fully, not in a way that stops it, because if he did, if there was a moment of clear recognition, something might have changed, something might have been corrected, but there is no indication of that, only a continuation, a progression, a life that keeps moving forward while something essential is slowly moving away. And that's when the insight finally settled in. Not as a conclusion, but as something I couldn't ignore anymore. That you don't lose your direction all at once, you lose it in degrees, in small adjustments, in quiet permissions, in decisions that feel harmless at the time, until one day, the direction you're moving in is no longer aligned with where you thought you were going. And by then, it doesn't feel like you chose it. It feels like you arrived there naturally, gradually, inevitably. And that's what makes it so dangerous, because when something feels inevitable, you stop questioning whether it should have happened at all. And I couldn't help but sit with that for a moment, because if someone with that level of awareness, that level of clarity, could drift like that without a clear point of resistance, without a moment of stopping, then what does that say about the rest of us? How many of our own shifts go unnoticed? How many of our own small adjustments feel justified in the moment? How many times do we tell ourselves that something doesn't matter because it's small, because it's temporary, because it doesn't change who we are? And what if those are the exact moments that shape everything that follows? Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, patiently, 1 degree at a time, until the direction itself becomes something entirely different from where it began. And then there comes a moment in the story where everything that was once subtle, everything that was once gradual, everything that could still be explained as adjustment, as accommodation, as complexity, can no longer hide behind those words, because the shift that had been happening quietly, piece by piece, finally takes form, not internally, not invisibly, but physically, publicly, undeniably. An altar is built. Not just anywhere, not hidden, not distant, but on a hill, in clear view, facing the very place that once defined everything, the temple, the place where his highest devotion had been expressed, the place where everything had once aligned. And I remember stopping there, not because the act itself was unexpected anymore, but because of where it happens, because placement changes everything. It transforms something internal into something visible, something symbolic, something that can no longer be dismissed as a small shift. This isn't a quiet permission anymore. This is a declaration, not necessarily in words, but in structure, in presence, in the reality of what now stands in that space, an altar to Malek. And if you understand even a fraction of what that represents, the weight of that moment becomes almost impossible to ignore, because this isn't just another belief. This isn't just another tradition. This is something that stands in direct opposition to everything that once defined him, everything that once guided him, everything he himself helped build. And yet, there it is, standing, not hidden, not temporary, but established. And what makes it even more difficult to process is that it exists at the same time, in the same landscape as the temple, the place that once represented the center of his devotion, the place where his journey toward wisdom began. Two structures, facing each other, two directions, coexisting in the same life. And that's when the contradiction reaches its peak, not as an abstract idea, but as something you can almost see, something you can imagine standing between, looking one way, then the other, realizing that both now exist within the same reality. And I couldn't help but ask myself, how does someone live in that tension? How does someone who once saw so clearly now allow something like this to stand without confronting it? Because at this point, it's no longer subtle, it's no longer hidden, it's no longer something that can be explained away as a small compromise. It's visible, it's real, it's there. And that's what makes it feel like a point of no return. Not because it happens suddenly, but because everything leading up to it has already made it possible. Every small shift, every quiet permission, every slight bend in direction has built toward this moment. And now that it exists, it changes everything that comes after. Because once something like this is established, once the contradiction becomes part of your environment, part of your reality, it's no longer about whether you will drift, it's about how far that drift will go. And I think that's what unsettled me the most. Not the act itself, but the realization that by something this visible appears, the real change has already happened. Long before, in ways that couldn't be seen, in decisions that felt harmless at the time, this moment, this altar, isn't the beginning of the fall. It's the evidence that the fall has already taken place, quietly, gradually, without interruption, and now it simply reveals itself. And that's what makes it so difficult to reverse, because you're no longer dealing with a direction. You're dealing with a reality that has already been built, something that now exists outside of thought, outside of intention, something that has taken form. And dismantling that isn't as simple as deciding to change, because it's not just inside you anymore, it's around you, embedded in your life, in your environment, in the structures you've allowed to stand. And I think that's where the story stops feeling distant, stops feeling like something that happened to someone else. Because when you strip away the scale, the history, the context, what remains is something very familiar. It's shuddered. The moment where a small shift becomes visible, the moment where what you allowed quietly now stands openly, the moment where you realize that something you once would have resisted now exists within your life without resistance. And by then, it doesn't feel like a choice anymore. It feels like something that has already been decided long before you recognized it. And that's why this moment matters so much, because it shows you exactly where the line is crossed, not when it begins, but when it becomes impossible to ignore. And once you see it, once you understand how it forms, you start to wonder, not just about him, but about yourself. What in your life has already been built that you haven't fully questioned yet? And this is where everything that once felt unshakable begins to change. Not all at once, not in a way that looks like immediate collapse, but in a way that feels almost inevitable in hindsight. Because once the internal shift has taken place, once the foundation has quietly moved, the external world begins to respond, slowly at first, then more clearly, as if something unseen has finally reached the surface. Enemies begin to rise, not suddenly, not from nowhere, but from places that had always existed, waiting, watching, adapting. Because power doesn't just create stability, it also creates pressure, and that pressure accumulates over time, especially when the balance that once held everything together starts to weaken. And what struck me here is that these threats don't appear as a single force. They emerge from different directions, different regions, different histories, as if the entire environment around his kingdom is beginning to shift at the same time, not coordinated, not planned together, but aligned in effect. From the south, resistance begins to form. From the north, opposition takes shape, and each of these forces carries its own story, its own reasons, its own momentum, built over years, perhaps decades of quiet tension, of unresolved conflict, of relationships that once held but are now beginning to strain. And it made me realize something I hadn't fully considered before, that external threats don't always start when something breaks. They often begin long before, but remain contained, controlled, manageable until something changes internally, until the system that once held them in place no longer has the same strength. Because when the center shifts even slightly, everything connected to it begins to feel that change. And then there's something even more unsettling, something that doesn't come from outside, but from within. Division. Not visible at first, not declared openly, but present, growing, moving beneath the surface of the kingdom. Because when a system becomes heavy, when it demands more than it once did, when the burden of maintaining it begins to fall unevenly, something begins to build among the people who carry that weight. Resentment. Not loud, not organized at first, but real, accumulating over time, shaped by labor, by expectation, by the quiet cost of sustaining something larger than themselves. And I couldn't help but think about how easily that part is overlooked, because from the outside, everything still looks powerful, still looks successful, but from within, something is shifting. Something that isn't measured in gold or trade or influence, but in how people feel, in what they're willing to carry, and for how long. And that's when another figure emerges, not as an enemy at first, not as a threat that demands immediate attention, but as someone positioned within the system itself, someone capable, competent, trusted enough to be given responsibility, someone who understands how everything works from the inside. Jeroboam. And what makes his role so significant is not just what he becomes later, but where he starts. Because he isn't an outsider. He isn't someone attacking from beyond the borders. He is part of the structure, part of the system that Solomon himself built, placed in a position where he can see its strengths and its weaknesses. And that's what makes this moment so important, because when change comes from within, it carries a different kind of weight, a different kind of inevitability. It doesn't have to break through defenses, it already exists inside them. And then something happens, not in the public eye, not in the center of power, but in a quiet encounter, almost hidden from everything else. A message, a shift, a declaration that what has been built will not remain as it is. Jeroboam is chosen, not by circumstance, not by ambition alone, but by something that redirects the future of the kingdom itself. And I remember feeling that moment differently, not as a dramatic turning point, but as a quiet confirmation. Because by the time something like this occurs, the outcome has already been set in motion, not externally, but internally, through everything that came before. The rise of enemies, the emergence of internal division, the appearance of a replacement. None of these are isolated events. They are responses, consequences, reflections of a deeper shift that has already taken place. And that's when the story begins to feel less like a sequence of events and more like a process unfolding, something that doesn't rely on a single cause, but on a series of changes that align over time. Because once the foundation moves, everything connected to it eventually follows. And I couldn't help but sit with that for a moment, because it suggests something that's hard to ignore, that the consequences we see at the end are often the result of things that started long before we ever recognized them. That what looks like collapse is often just the final stage of something that has been building quietly, consistently, beneath the surface. And if that's true, then the question isn't just why things fall apart, but when the process actually begins and whether we would recognize it if we were in the middle of it ourselves. And this is the moment where the story becomes almost impossible to reconcile with everything that came before. Not because it's shocking in the way we usually expect, but because it feels like a quiet confirmation of something we've been trying not to fully accept. Because by now, the shift isn't subtle anymore. It isn't hidden beneath small decisions or quiet compromises. It's visible, not just in what is happening around him, but in how he responds to it. Because when the message about Jeroboam reaches him, when he realizes that something is changing, that the structure he built may not remain intact, that another has been chosen to take part of what he once controlled completely, you might expect something different, something closer to the man he once was. You might expect reflection, pause, even a moment of recognition. But that's not what happens. Instead, there is a decision, immediate, direct, unmistakable. He tries to kill him. And I remember sitting with that for a moment, not because it's violent. Violence has already been part of his story from the beginning, but because of what it represents now. Because earlier, those decisions could be understood within the context of securing power, stabilizing a fragile transition, eliminating clear threats. But this feels different. This isn't about establishing a kingdom. This is about holding onto it. And that distinction matters, because when you act to build something, the logic feels constructive, purposeful, even when it's harsh. But when you act to preserve something that is already beginning to shift away from you, the motivation changes. It becomes reactive, defensive, driven by something deeper than strategy. And that's where the difference becomes clear. Not in the action itself, but in what's behind it. Because this isn't the same Solomon who once asked for understanding. This isn't the same mind that chose clarity over control. This isn't the same person who could see through human behavior with almost perfect precision. This is someone else. Not entirely different, not unrecognizable at a glance, but changed in a way that affects everything that follows. And what unsettled me the most is not that he made this choice, but that there is no indication of hesitation, no visible struggle between what he once valued and what he is now doing. No moment where the past version of himself pushes back against the present one. It just happens, as if the shift has already been completed, as if the internal movement that began quietly, long ago, has now reached a point where it defines his response without question. And that's when it became impossible for me to ignore the conclusion that had been forming slowly throughout the story. He is no longer the same person, not in the way that matters most. Because identity isn't defined by what you say you believe. It's defined by what you do when something challenges you, when something threatens your position, when something forces you to choose between holding on to power or holding on to who you once were. And in that moment, the choice is clear, power wins. And I think that's what made this realization so heavy, because it doesn't happen suddenly. It doesn't feel like a betrayal in the moment. It feels like a continuation, like a natural response to a situation that demands action. And that's exactly why it's so difficult to detect when it's happening, because from the inside, it probably doesn't feel like a loss of self. It feels like necessity, like protection, like doing what must be done. But from the outside, when you step back, when you compare this moment to where he started, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Because the man who once asked for wisdom now reacts with force. The man who once sought understanding now seeks control. The man who once listened now acts without reflection. And that contrast, subtle in its progression, but undeniable in its outcome, is where the story becomes something more than history. It becomes a mirror, because it forces a question that's hard to avoid. Not about him, but about ourselves. At what point does adaptation become transformation? At what point do the decisions we justify as necessary begin to reshape who we are? At what point do we cross from being someone who acts with clarity to someone who simply reacts to preserve what we have? And the most difficult part is that there's no clear answer. No single moment you can point to. No line that announces itself when it's crossed. Only a series of choices. Each one small enough to explain, each one reasonable in isolation, but together, powerful enough to change everything. And by the time you recognize it, it's no longer a possibility. It's already who you've become. And then there is this final layer of the story that feels almost separate from everything else. Not because it is disconnected, but because it reveals something that no external event ever could. Something that comes from within, from reflection, from time, from a mind that has already lived through everything we've just seen. The rise, the control, the expansion, the quiet drift, the visible shift, and now, something else begins to emerge. His words, not spoken in the moment, not tied to a specific decision, but written, preserved, carried across time in a way that actions alone cannot be. And when I started looking at them closely, not as isolated texts, but as reflections of a life, something unexpected began to form, because they don't all point in the same direction. They don't all carry the same tone. They don't all come from the same place within him. Instead, they feel like fragments, different windows into different stages of his understanding. And the first of these feels familiar, almost exactly what we would expect. Proverbs, a collection of insight, clarity, observations about life that feel grounded, structured, precise, statements about wisdom, discipline, behavior, cause and effect. The kind of thinking that reflects control, understanding, a mind that sees patterns and articulates them with confidence. And reading those, I could still see the version of Solomon that made sense to me, the one who understood how the world works, the one who could guide others, the one whose clarity felt stable, almost unshakable, because everything in that perspective aligns with the idea that life can be understood, that choices matter, that wisdom leads somewhere real. And then there is something else, something softer, more emotional, more human in a different way. The Song of Solomon, a text that moves away from structure, away from analysis, into something that feels almost intimate, personal, focused on love, desire, connection, not as a strategy, not as a system, but as an experience. And this shift from logic to emotion, from control to expression, adds another layer to who he is, because it shows that his understanding wasn't limited to systems and decisions. It extended into the complexity of human feeling, the kind of depth that doesn't follow rules as easily, and feels like everything fits, like the different parts of his life are balanced, integrated, aligned in a way that makes sense. Wisdom, emotion, power, all coexisting within one person. But then there is the third voice, the one that feels different from everything else, the one that doesn't reinforce what came before, but questions it. Ecclesiastes. And this is where everything shifts again, not externally, but internally, in a way that feels heavier, quieter, almost like a conclusion that took a lifetime to reach, because the tone changes, the certainty fades. The clarity that once defined his thinking becomes something else, something more reflective, more uncertain, more aware of limitations. And as I read through it slowly, carefully, trying to understand where it was coming from, one phrase kept returning again and again, almost like a refrain, something that anchors everything else. Everything is vapor, or as it's often translated, everything is vanity. But when you sit with the original idea, when you try to feel what it actually means, it's not just about emptiness, it's about transience, about something that appears solid, meaningful, and yet cannot be held, cannot be kept, cannot last, like breath, like mist, something that exists and then disappears. And that realization coming from someone who had experienced everything, who had built everything, who had reached levels of success that most people will never even approach, carries a weight that is hard to ignore. Because this isn't theory, this isn't speculation, this is reflection. And what it reflects isn't the confidence of Proverbs or the passion of Song of Solomon. It's something quieter, something that feels like the end of a long journey, the moment where everything is seen not from the beginning, but from the end. And I couldn't help but ask myself, what does it take to arrive at that conclusion? What kind of life leads someone to look back at everything they've built, everything they've experienced, everything they once valued, and describe it in that way, not as failure, not as success, but as something that ultimately cannot be held onto. And that's when it started to feel less like a philosophical statement and more like something deeply personal, something shaped by everything that came before: the rise, the control, the drift, the contradictions. Because when you see that phrase in isolation, it feels abstract. But when you place it within the context of his life, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a reflection of someone who has tested every dimension of existence: power, wealth, wisdom, pleasure, control, and found that none of them provide what they seem to promise. Not because they are meaningless in the moment, but because they don't endure, they don't anchor, they don't remain. And that's what stayed with me. Not the statement itself, but the weight behind it, the sense that this wasn't something he believed at the beginning, it's something he arrived at slowly, over time, through everything he lived. And once you see it that way, it changes how you understand the entire story. Because now it's not just about what he lost, it's about what he learned. Too late, or maybe just in time. But either way, it leaves you with something that doesn't feel like an answer. It feels like a question, one that doesn't go away easily. And this is where the story leaves me, not with a clear answer, not with a conclusion that resolves everything neatly, but with a question, one that feels heavier the longer I sit with it. Because after everything we've seen, the rise, the precision, the wisdom, the expansion, the quiet drift, the visible contradiction, the unraveling that followed, there is still something we don't fully know. Did he regret it? Did Solomon ever truly see what had happened to him? Not just externally, not just in the loss of stability, but internally, in the way his direction had shifted, in the way his choices had slowly reshaped who he was. Did he recognize that? Did he feel it? Did he try to return? And the unsettling part is we don't have a clear answer because the texts don't give us a moment of restoration. They don't show a final turning point where everything is corrected, where clarity returns in the same way it once existed. Instead, we are left with reflections, fragments, insights that feel deep but incomplete, like echoes of a realization rather than a full resolution. And I find myself going back to those words again. Everything is vapor. Everything slips through your hands. Everything that once felt solid eventually fades. And I wonder, are those the words of someone who has made peace, or the words of someone who has simply seen too much to believe in the same things again? Because those are not the same. One comes with clarity, the other comes with distance, and the difference between them matters. But we're never told which one it is. We're never given the moment where he stands still and fully confronts everything that happened. We're never shown whether he returns to the center of what once grounded him, or whether he simply continues forward, carrying that awareness without changing direction. And maybe that's intentional. Maybe the absence of that answer is part of the story itself, because it forces the question outward, away from him and toward us. And that's where I found myself lingering, not in what he did, not in how it ended, but in what it means when there is no clear resolution, because we like stories that close, stories that reassure us, stories where mistakes are corrected, where lessons are learned in a way that feels complete. But this isn't that kind of story. This is the kind that leaves space, uncertainty, something unresolved that continues beyond the final moment. And that's what makes it stay with you. Because without a clear ending, the responsibility shifts. It's no longer about understanding him, it's about understanding ourselves. Because if someone like him, someone who saw so clearly, someone who understood so deeply, someone who reached heights most people will never even approach, could still move in a direction that led to this, then what does that say about the rest of us? Not in a dramatic sense, not in a way that suggests we will repeat the same story exactly, but in a quieter way. a more subtle way? Would we even notice if we were drifting? Would we recognize the small shifts when they begin? Would we question the decisions that feel justified in the moment? Or would we do exactly what he did, continue forward, adjusting, adapting, believing that everything is still aligned, until one day something feels different, and we can't quite explain why? And I think that's the question that matters most. Not whether he regretted it, but whether we would recognize it in ourselves, because regret comes after, recognition comes before, and the space between those two moments is where everything is decided. And as I sit with that, I realize something I didn't expect when I first started looking into this story. It doesn't feel like a distant history anymore. It feels like a mirror, something that reflects possibilities, not certainties, directions, not outcomes, patterns that exist not just in the past, but in the way we live, the way we decide, the way we slowly shape our own paths without always realizing it. And maybe that's the real weight of it. Not that he failed, but that he shows how it happens, quietly, gradually, without a single moment that feels like the end. And if that's true, then the final question isn't about him at all, it's about us. If the wisest man who ever lived could lose his way slowly, silently, while everything around him still looks successful, then what makes us think we're different? And more importantly, what are we doing right now that might be shaping that direction without us even noticing it yet?